There's this recurring question or concern that keeps coming up in organizing spaces that I'm in. I also see it online on a literal daily basis. And I think it's important that we try and address it here again for a moment. I know I've touched on it a bit in the past. Okay, so the question comes in a couple different iterations, but it's all basically the same thing. So let me lay them out here. When do we move from nonviolent to violent resistance? Or why are we committed to nonviolent discipline versus armed violent resistance? Peaceful protest is great, y'all, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't stop the bad guys. So when is it that we're all going to get 2A and exercise our rights and form militias and topple the United States military, right? These are the questions that we see over and over. I didn't mean to laugh because I think that these are questions asked in earnest. I do always say that it's really important when you hear people advocating for tactics that the data does not support as being effective. When you hear people who are spreading doomer messages of it's all hopeless and we're cooked and we've already lost and we should just give up. Or when you hear people spreading mis and disinformation about the Epstein files, when you hear people who say things like, when are y'all gonna take up arms against the government? It's good to ask yourself, who benefits from that rhetoric, right? I am always asking myself. I know people say trust, but verify. No. I don't have any fucking trust, right? Other than the people I'm organizing with, right? I have trust and solidarity with like my affinity group. But when I'm hearing shit from strangers online, even from social media creators online, there's no trust but verify. There's just verify. If I verify enough times, I will start to extend a little bit of trust to you, but I'm not going to obligatorily trust some stranger on the internet, especially not one who is advocating for tactics or positions that I know from the research are detrimental to the cause. So if they're saying something that is going to sabotage the pro-democracy movement, either intentionally or not intentionally, it's good to ask yourself, who benefits from that rhetoric? Who benefits from that messaging? And it doesn't mean that the person who's repeating that message is in of themselves a bad actor. It does mean that perhaps they have listened to bad actors. They've maybe been propagandized a little bit. Maybe there's some psyop that's worked on them a little bit. And I think also living in America, our government is not wanting us to understand what it takes to have an effective resistance movement against the government. Our government doesn't want us to know what actually works in exercising our power as the American people. A lot of people have a vested interest both in our government and in the corporations who currently control our government. Thanks, Citizens United. Thanks, SCOTUS. They have a vested interest in making sure that we are ignorant of what actually makes for effective tactics. And also think for a second about how much glorification of the military there is in American culture. We're the biggest, most powerful military. And the ways that we learn about resistance, the ways that we learn about stopping bad guys are often through cinema, often through, like Oscar-winning movies with like sweeping war scenes. And that it's American soldiers taking up arms against, fascist governments that stop the bad guys. It really does an awful lot of good, right, for the United States military and our government to present the American military as all powerful, can stop any bad guy. And also, they're the heroes, and also the only way to stop a bad guy is with our military. So when our military is used by our government as the bad guys, then like what are we supposed to do if we've been taught through all of our kind of like popular media that the only way to stop a bad guy is with the US military? Like, oh shit, we're fucked, right? And I think a lot of that is what we're seeing now in the US. We've been enculturated to believe that stopping bad guys, effective resistance, toppling authoritarians must be done through violent resistance. How much of that is propaganda, and how much of that also is like, like the No movement in Chile wasn't going to sell a bunch of tickets. It wasn't going to win any Oscars to see regular, ordinary people like door knocking and be like, hi, let me tell you about the No campaign and how important it is that you turn out to vote. By the way, would you sign this petition? By the way, let's just make sure that you're registered to vote. Like that doesn't make for Oscar-winning movies, but that's how successful revolutionary movements topple authoritarians. So we just have been taught so many myths about the work that we are now engaged in, and likewise, the truth of those successful strategies has been hidden from us. And so the average American is astoundingly ignorant about what it takes to build an effective mass mobilization movement of the people to enact social change. Astoundingly ignorant. It's not only because our government doesn't want us to understand how to resist oppression from them, but it's also because the political right in this country White supremacist Christo-fascists have done such a good job for decades, especially when it comes to American public education, especially when it comes to making sure that we don't learn about our own history, not just the history of other movements around the world, but our own history, right? How hard they have fought to make sure that American children are ignorant of the civil rights movement, not only the truth of the civil rights movement, how bad things were in this country, but also so that we don't know what it is that civil rights leaders actually did in order to enact change. Again, who benefits? Who benefits by the American people being kept ignorant of one of the most powerful nonviolent resistance movements in the history of the world, definitely in the history of the United States? Likewise, we're not taught about the end of apartheid in South Africa, especially the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Like, they don't, maybe that's a topic for a whole other video, but most Americans don't know anything about that. Who benefits by keeping us in the dark? Who benefits by keeping us ignorant? Who benefits by perpetuating this myth that the only way to stop the bad guys is to have the American military do it? Otherwise, it's fucking hopeless, right? The American people, what do we do when the military turns on us? We're told nothing, or we're told you got to rise up in arms against your own government. And how successful is that going to be against the largest, most powerful military in the world? And what I mean by that, I'm going to be referencing here, by the way, a little bit more from Why Civil Resistance Works by Chenoweth and Steffen, is that when we have a nonviolent movement versus a violent movement, and we are talking about mass sustained opposition against the regime, people non-violently resisting in small ways as individuals, but also engaged in mass collective action that is rent strikes, labor strikes, boycotts, voting, public protest, right? All of these really big ways that we are publicly opposed to what the regime is doing. And likewise, as individuals and small groups, we are making sure that we're engaged in mutual aid. We are eroding the pillars of support under the regime. When we utilize these nonviolent direct actions, again, not peaceful, nonviolence cannot be peaceful, nonviolence must be disruptive, and we also must understand that though we are committed to nonviolence, the regime is committed to being violent toward us. The state will obligatorily be violent toward us, no matter how nonviolent we are. We saw that on full display in the civil rights movement. Americans trying to exercise their rights, trying to claim rights that the government was denying them, and the government consistently being unbelievably violent and brutal toward them. Nonviolent resistance is not peaceful, it's not passive, it must be disruptive, and we must understand that we undertake a significant amount of risk to engage in it. But what we know about those nonviolent resistance movements is that they are twice as likely to succeed against an authoritarian as to fail. And so I like to tell people, what we know from the data is that violent resistance movements are basically going to fail about 74% of the time. We are doubling the chance that we will not stop the authoritarian and that we will lose our democracy by becoming violent. And you might say, well, what about those 26% or so of the times that they were successful? That the violent folks did win? Well, what happens in those instances is overwhelmingly, those are outliers. And what happens is that when you see violent resistance groups, that an outside military force or funding from another government will come in to assist them. Oh, that's the US military. We do that. We go in and we fund these guerrilla groups. We fund some kind of resistance movement. Or some other nation does, right? You see input support from another country aiding that violent movement. And so it's not the people on their own, it's largely funding from outside. And none of those stories are about anybody going up against the American military. I just want to make that really clear. We're often the folks who are coming in and assisting. The other thing I want to say here at the end, and this is what is really, really important to understand. When you have violent resistance that becomes effective in toppling an authoritarian, what you often end up with is cycles of coups and violence. You often end up with one authoritarian being replaced by another. And it's really important. We know from the data, it's really important that we begin as we mean to go along. If we want democracy after this, if we want nonviolence and the rule of law after this versus might makes right, versus whoever's in power can hurt everybody else to get their way and keep their power, then we have to commit to nonviolence. When we see violent resistance, it doesn't mean that it creates a stable government after it topples the bad guy. More often than not, it creates another authoritarian regime. And so we have to think about not just stopping Donald Trump and the fascists in Project 2025. We have to think about what kind of America we want to build afterward. Those who are in charge of the resistance of the revolution now, those are the people who get to craft the future of this country.